So today we will be discussing about ecosystem. You have already studied about ecosystem in a general class, so I'll just give you a small brief introduction. So when we talk about ecosystem, it means an organism and its surroundings. So generally when we talk about ecosystem, it is divided into two parts: the biotic and abiotic components. Biotic means the living organisms, that is the plants and the animals. Abiotic means the non-living components like air, water, sunlight, etc. So when we talk about the biotic components, these are basically classified into producers and consumers. So when we talk about producers, it basically implies the green plants which help in the production of the major part of the energy, and this energy is consumed by the consumers, that is the animals. So again, these consumers are further divided into primary consumers, secondary consumers and tertiary consumers. So the flow of energy in the form of food from the producers to the consumers, that is the primary consumer, secondary consumer and tertiary consumer, ensures a flow of energy, and this basically flow of energy in the form of food is also known as food chain. So when complex food chains interact with each other, that means many food chains are mixing, it leads to the formation of a food web. Abiotic, that is your wind, water, temperature, sunlight, soil, all these affect the biotic components. So since we're discussing about ecosystems, today we'll be concentrating only on aquatic ecosystems. Aquatic ecosystems, by this what it means is ecosystems involving water bodies. So when we talk about water bodies, again there are two major types of ecosystems: marine ecosystems and freshwater ecosystems. Marine ecosystems are characterized by high salt content and freshwater low salt content. So basically when we talk about marine ecosystems, the first thing that comes to our mind are oceans and seas. So your marine ecosystem is basically divided into the Neretic zone and the Oceanic zone. This is a slope of land that steepens deeply and again it flattens. This forms the ocean bed, and this region is also characterized as abyssal zone. This zone is very deep and there is no light. Neretic zone is a zone that is close to the land. This is generally the shallow water zone and is also known as the littoral zone. Then this deep steep fall is known as the continental rise. It basically divides the zones of the ocean from Neretic and Oceanic zone. The Oceanic zone is again divided into three parts. Abyssal zone means the zone which is very deep and there is no penetration of light. Then we get the benthic zone. There is partial penetration of light, but since the light is that not strong, there is no photosynthesis in this zone. But in this case, you find your phytoplanktons, your algae, and what happens is photosynthesis takes place. This is also known as the littoral zone, but it is not as shallow as compared to the Neretic littoral zone. So when we talk about this, Your littoral zone mainly produces, that is your algae and phytoplankton. Again, in this zone, you also find your consumers, that is your small floating or microorganisms like dinoflagellates and zooplanktons, and again small fishes. So basically in the benthic zone, they depend on the food from the littoral zone. And your abyssal zone, since there is complete absence of light, this is basically composed of dead decaying matter, and this dead decaying matter is decomposed by bacteria, and again you might find deep lying sea creatures which basically depend on the food from the benthic zone. So this is how your marine ecosystems are classified. Now moving on to freshwater ecosystems. Again, these are divided into two types. One is standing or still water, that is your ponds and lakes. So these are called lentic ecosystems, and your running water, that is your rivers and streams, these are called lotic ecosystems. So your lentic ecosystem, let's take into example a small pond. It's classified into littoral zone, limnatic zone, and profundal zone. Again, littoral zone is a shallow water zone, penetration of light. Limnatic zone also, there is penetration of light, but it's slightly deeper than the littoral zone. Again, profundal, no light. Suppose in cases of ponds which are not very deep, the entire area might just consist of littoral zone only. But if the ponds and the lakes are deep, then the zones can be characterized into littoral zone, limnatic zone, and profundal zone. Lotic means running water ecosystems, basically your rivers. So the rivers has been divided into two zones, Potamon zone and Rithron zone. Rithron zone is characterized by fast moving waters, whereas the Potamon zone is characterized by slow moving water. So this is how your your freshwater ecosystems have been classified. So now moving on from your ecosystems, we will talk about biotic succession. By biotic succession, what it means is a community is replaced by a higher, more advanced community. So this might lead from a beginning community to several communal stages and finally a stable community. So your beginner community, also known as the pioneer community. That means this basically consists of organisms which were first involved in the establishment of an ecosystem. Slowly, these communities are represented by different types of communities characterized by C1, C2, and C3, and finally a stable community, which is the predominant existing community. So when these changes are occurring, what happens is the community that is being established changes the environment. When it starts changing the environment, it no longer becomes adaptable or suitable to survive in the changing environment. So this community gets replaced by a higher, more advanced community. Again, the same thing happens. Again, it also changes the environment, and again, it is no longer able to survive in the changing environment conditions. So again, it is replaced by another higher community. This happens till a community no longer influences the environment. Since the final community is no longer changing the environment or is being affected by the changes in environmental condition, this is known as a stable community or a climax community. So the successive changes of community leading to the establishment of a stable community is known as biotic succession. So when we talk about biotic succession, again it has been classified into various types: primary succession and secondary succession. By primary succession, what it means is generally the succession occurs in a barren land by a pioneer community. But in a secondary succession, what happens is already a community exists. These community might be wiped out due to natural disasters or calamities, and again it leads to establishment of a new community. So basically, when a new community establishes due to the removal of a pre-existing community, it is known as secondary succession. But when we talk about primary succession, it means the first establishment of a community. Again, your communities are again further divided into autogenic and allogenic. Autogenic is due to environmental changes. I already told you, like when a community succession is taking place, this community is being replaced by C2 due to change in environment. So this type of succession is called autogenic succession. But whereas allogenic succession is not due to environmental changes. So this is the main difference between autogenic and allogenic. Again, your succession further divided into autotrophic and heterotrophic. By autotrophic succession, what it means is it's basically characterized by the presence of green plants, because green plants have the ability to produce their own food, and these are called autotrophs, hence autotrophic succession. Heterotrophic is characterized by heterotrophs. That means organisms having a heterotrophic mode of nutrition. Another important characteristic is inorganic substances are used. But in heterotrophic, you're basically using organic substances. These are the main differences between autotrophic and heterotrophic. So depending on the type of succession, your succession has been divided into either primary or secondary, autogenic or allogenic, and autotrophic or heterotrophic. So how your succession occurs is, the first thing is migration. By migration, what it means is birds and animals can disperse seeds. So when a seed is transferred from one area to another by an animal or bird, it is called migration. Now, the seed that has been migrated, it germinates. So this is called excesses. That means germination of the migrated seeds. Now, after excesses, what happens is these germinating seeds, they grow into new plants. As a result, new plants grow and they also reproduce, and then what happens is increase in population occurs. This is known as aggregation or colonization. So once the population increases, what happens is competition begins for resources, that is your food and meats. So due to competition, what happens is the weaker species of plants, they are lost. Now what happens is, once the weaker species are lost, the space that they live is again invaded by newer, stronger species, and this is known as invasion. Since the stronger species will eventually wipe out the weaker species, it leads to a new community. This new community again changes the environment. So again, it's no longer able to survive in the changing environment, and again a new community comes and takes its place. This continues till you finally get a stable community. So the first step is always migration, that is the transfer of germinating seeds. Then next is accesses. By accesses, what it means is the growth of the transferred seeds, and these seeds grow into new plants. Eventually there will be an increase in their number, and once their numbers increases, that stage is known as aggregation or colonization. So due to the increase in the population, there will be competition among themselves for the resources, and once competition takes place, the weaker plants are eliminated. The spaces left open by the weakest plants are invaded by stronger plants. That stage is known as invasion, and finally the stronger species will develop into a new community. The new community affects the environment, so it eventually gets replaced by a new community. This changes carries on till you finally get a stable community. So understand the succession better, I'll give you an example of succession in a pond ecosystem. So the first case, the pond is affected by algae. Algae becomes the pioneer organism. That means it is the chief producer. So due to the increase in the algae, what happens is this algae increases the nutrient content of the pond. That means algae, they grow, reproduce and eventually die, thereby increasing the nutrient content. Once the nutrient content starts to increase, plants start to grow. That is your submerged plants like hydrilla. These hydrilla, they again perform photosynthesis, increase the oxygen concentration of the pond, and at the same time also the nutrients get cycled in the pond. That means the nutrients produced by the algae are being utilized by the submerged plants, and in turn they are also increasing the oxygen concentration. During this process, what happens is the depth of the pond decreases. Next, these submerged plants are replaced by floating plants like Nelumbo. So again, these floating plants also, what they do is they keep on increasing the oxygen concentration, nutrient cycles become more efficient, and finally we reach a swamp stage and from a swamp stage to a forest stage. That means during this process what happens is the water, that is your pond, gets completely removed, leading to the establishment of a forest stage. So in this case, the pioneer organism was your algae, which were capable of performing photosynthesis and increasing the nutrient constituents. So now what happens is, when these were happening, not only plants were being able to survive in the changing communities, but also animals. When we talk about animals, the changing animals in the communities were basically your zooplanktons, then spiders, your floating insects, small fishes, and so on. So eventually, in a forest community, all the smaller animals were replaced by larger animals and birds. So this is the end of the succession.